Hello, my name is Tara and I'm going to be going over my presentation on fallacies. So starting off, what is a fallacy? A fallacy is a mistaken belief, especially one based on an unsound argument. So fallacies can either be illegitimate arguments or irrelevant points, and they're often identified because they lack evidence that supports their claim. So there are three types of fallacies that we're going to go over in this PowerPoint: logical, emotional, and ethical fallacies. So be sure to avoid these common fallacies in your own arguments and watch for them in the arguments of others. So starting off with logical fallacies. So a logical fallacy is a statement that seems to be true until you apply the rules of logic. Then you realize that it's not. Logical fallacies can often be used to mislead people, to trick them into believing something they otherwise wouldn't. Sometimes it's from small mistakes, but sometimes it's just used to create a false narrative. How do they work? They provide reasonable false assumptions that trick the audience into believing the argument. And they distract you from relevant information, and they require support for the conclusion that depends on the conclusion being already true. What should you do when faced with one? You need to make sure the logical appeals does not override proper logical thinking. You can do that by identifying the argument's conclusion and reasons, and determining the validity of the reasons by considering your own valid reasons and then comparing them to the arguer's reasons to see if they are consistent. Consider any necessary assumptions by asking: if the reason were true, what does a reasonable person have to believe for it to support the conclusion logically, and what does one have to believe for the reason to be true? Assess whether or not the assumptions are reasonable and sensible. Next, make sure the logical appeals do not interfere with any fairness and objectivity. Make sure logical appeals are controlled and ethical. And lastly, make sure you are aware of different types of logical appeals and be sure to be vigilant. Now we're going to go over common logical fallacies and define them, as well as look at some examples of them so that you know more about it. So the first one that we're going to talk about is card stacking. Card stacking or hoarding is sorry for the noise. So card stacking is stacking evidence in a slanted, distorted, or fabricated way in order to strengthen one side of an issue at the expense of another viewpoint. I don't necessarily have an example for this one, so we're just gonna move on. The next one is begging the question, which occurs when a writer simply restates the claim in a different way, in such a way that an argument is circular. An example would be: his lies are evident from the untruthful nature of his statements, which they're basically saying the same thing, just worded a little weirdly. Next is faulty analogy, which is an inaccurate, inappropriate, or misleading comparison between two things. Letting prisoners out early on early release is like absolving them of their crimes, which is not true. Last example is hasty generalization, which draws conclusions from scanty evidence. I wouldn't eat at that restaurant. The only time I ate there, my entree was undercooked, which is a hasty generalization because just one time does not make the whole restaurant bad. Moving on to emotional fallacies. So, emotional fallacy, also known as appealing to one's emotions, is the manipulation of emotions without any regards to the acceptable argument. People often use this fallacy in order to get what they want without any regard strictly based upon facts, rather than it firmly based on emotions. Such examples of emotional fallacies include getting more donations, selling more of their products, or getting others to do what they want. Ultimately, the emotional fallacy is a very successful tool in persuading others. So, how do they work? They are employed to arouse strong feelings in the audience. They appeal to emotion. Next, they are based on the concept called transfer, which is a device of association in which the connotations, deeper embedded meanings of words or images manipulate our responses. Next, as positive transfer, which look presents ideas in a positive fashion. Lastly, is negative transfer, which presents the ideas in ways that play on negative emotions such as fear, anger, or envy. Now we're going to look at 3 examples and go over their definition and examples of one. So the first one is sentimental abuse, which use emotion to distract the audience from the facts. An example would be the thousands of baby seals killed in the Exxon Valdez oil spill have shown us that oil is not a reliable energy source. Next is bandwagon appeals, which encourage an audience to agree with the writer based on because everyone else is doing so. An example would be Paris Hilton carries a small dog in her purse, so you should buy a hairless chihuahua and put it in your Louis Vuitton. Last one is scare tactics, which try to frighten people into agreeing with the arguer by threatening them or predicting unrealistic dire consequences. An example would be if you don't support the party tax plan, you and your family will be reduced to poverty, which is just solely used to scare the audience. Last fallacy we're going to look at is ethical fallacies, which there's no good way to explain or define this, but it's just an advancement of the writer's own authority on the character. We're going to look at some examples to help us understand it better. So the first one is false authority, which asks audience to agree with the assertion of a writer based simply on his or her character or the authority of another person or institution who may not fully be qualified to offer that assertion. An example would be, my high school teacher said it, so it must be true. It was just because they said it does not make it true. Next is using authority instead of evidence, which occurs when someone offers personal authority as proof. An example would be, trust me, my best friend wouldn't do that, which that does not prove anything. Last one is moral equivalence, which compares minor problems with much more serious crimes or vice versa. An example would be, these military seatbelts are fascist, but that does not make any sense. You're comparing just a small thing to such a big thing. Moving on, we're gonna look at a specific example and go in detail about that specific thing or topic. So, there was a case in 1968, Dillon versus Lake, It was recognized that relatives could bring a lawsuit for emotional distress without any physical injury. It was after a child was hit by a car and killed his sister, who witnessed the accident and sued the car drivers, claiming emotional distress. So we're gonna look at a specific type of common fallacy, which is slippery slope, which is an argument that suggests taking a minor action would lead to major and sometimes ludicrous consequences. An example would be, if we allow the children to choose the movie this time, they're going to expect to be able to choose the school they go to or the doctors they visit, which is making just a small decision into such a big thing. Hence, we're looking at this Facebook fallacy. So, Facebook had a video of it and it was blasted all over, and they wouldn't take it down. And the reason for this was slippery slope. They believed that if they took down this one thing and agreed to their case, then it would lead to many others coming towards them to sue them for small things. So that's the reason why they didn't agree to the case, is because they thought that if they agreed to this one case, many people would come expecting the same thing. Now we're gonna go over some audience questions. Question number 1: why should you look for fallacies in rhetoric? My answer is 1, to spot distortions and specious arguments, and 2, to avoid them in your own argumentative writing. Last question: how do you protect yourself from fallacies when considering arguments? My answer is that 1, be skeptical, question first impressions and gut reactions. 2, check source documentation carefully. 3, research claims to verify their validity. And 4, understand the terminology of fallacies, which is what I went over in this PowerPoint. Thank you.